The night Marcus Hale cut the chains off an alien girl behind a government warehouse, he wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to avoid his own problems. He had $32 in his wallet, a broken truck, and a court date in 11 days for a debt he couldn't pay. He was supposed to be delivering scrap metal across the Nevada desert. He was not supposed to be crouching behind a military facility at 2 in the morning, cutting zip ties off the wrists of a 6-foot silver-skinned creature who was staring at him with 4 white eyes that didn't blink. She didn't say thank you. She looked at him the way you look at a stray dog who just wandered into your kitchen, surprised, a little alarmed, and not sure yet whether this was a problem. He had no idea that 18 months later, she would come back. He had no idea what she would bring with her. And he had no idea that the question he would have to answer, the hardest one of his entire life, would have nothing to do with aliens or governments or first contact. It would be about what kind of man he wanted to be. This is that story. Marcus Hale was not a complicated man. He fixed things for money, drove things for money, and occasionally moved things for money without asking too many questions about what those things were. He was 38 years old, lived in a single wide trailer outside of Caliente, Nevada, and owned one good jacket and a truck that was developing an opinion about whether it wanted to start on cold mornings. His credit score was a number he had stopped looking at. His social life was a Tuesday poker game with 3 other men who were all worse off than him, which was the closest thing to comfort he had found in a decade. He was not unhappy, exactly. He had just stopped expecting things to get better. The night everything changed, he was driving Route 93 at 2 in the morning, hauling a flatbed of salvage metal to a buyer in Ely. The job paid $400, which would cover his electric bill and leave enough for groceries if he didn't buy anything stupid. He had done this drive 40 times. He knew where the speed traps were. He knew which diner had coffee strong enough to keep him awake and which one would give him food poisoning. He knew the desert out here the way you only know a place after years of crossing it alone at night, which is to say he knew it was empty and dark and that it didn't care about him at all, and he had made his peace with that. He almost didn't stop. The shape on the side of the road was small and wrong. Not roadkill wrong. Not broken down car wrong. Wrong in a way his brain refused to classify for a full 2 seconds while his foot moved to the brake on its own, the way your hand pulls back from a hot stove before your mind has finished deciding it hurts. He pulled over. Sat in the truck with the engine running for a moment. Looked in the side mirror. Looked at the shape. Got out. She was behind a concrete barrier, partially hidden, and she was not human. He knew this before he was close enough to see clearly. He knew it the way you know a dream has turned without being able to point to the exact moment. She was tall, he would later estimate 6 feet, maybe slightly more, with skin that was pale silver gray in the truck's headlights, textured like overlapping scales but smooth to the eye, like brushed aluminum. She had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on her face, all of them a flat, reflective white. No visible pupils. Her hands were bound behind her back with heavy black zip ties, 2 sets layered over each other. Her ankles were bound too. She was wearing what looked like the remnants of a gray jumpsuit, cut and torn in places, and there was a dried dark stain on her upper arm that Marcus looked at once and then decided not to look at again. She was conscious. She watched him approach without moving. He stopped about 6 feet away. His heart was going at a rate that made coherent thought difficult. Every reasonable part of his brain was delivering a clear and unified message: get back in the truck. The unreasonable part of his brain, the part that had once pulled a stranger's dog out of a flooded ditch and spent 2 hours in the rain trying to find the owner, was already doing a different calculation. "Are you hurt?" he said. She blinked. All 4 eyes, at slightly different intervals, like a ripple across her face. She said something. It was not English. It was not anything he had a word for, a series of sounds that moved through registers his ears weren't fully equipped to process, some of it pitched below what he would normally consider speech. "I don't understand that," he said. "But, okay." He went back to the truck. Got his multi-tool. Came back. She watched him the whole time with those white eyes, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was running calculations of her own, deciding whether he was a threat, deciding whether the zip ties were a worse situation than whatever he might turn out to be. He crouched down and cut the ankle ties first, giving her mobility before he went near her hands, because it seemed like the right thing to do, because it gave her options. She noticed this. He didn't know how he knew she noticed it, but he did. He moved behind her and cut the wrist ties. She stood. Not slowly, not shakily. She stood the way something stands when it has been holding itself together through discipline alone and is now simply choosing to stop hiding how strong it is. She was a full head taller than him. She looked down at her wrists, turned them over, examined the marks the ties had left. Then, she looked at him. He said, "Do you need water?" "I have water in the truck." She said something again in her language. He didn't move. She looked at the truck, looked back at him, and then walked past him toward the vehicle with a steadiness that made him feel, briefly, like the smaller of the two of them. He gave her water. She drank it. Not the way a desperate person drinks urgently, gratefully, but with a kind of controlled deliberateness, watching him over the bottle the entire time. When she was done, she set it on the seat with what he could only describe as precision. He stood outside the truck door, arms loosely at his sides, and said, "I don't know what you need. I don't know where you're going. I don't know what happened to you." He paused. "But, if you want to ride somewhere, I'm going north. That's the only direction I've got tonight." She looked at him for a long time. She got in the truck. He drove. He didn't ask questions. He played the radiolope, a country station, the old kind, and watched the road, and she sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the desert the way someone looks at something they are trying to memorize. After about 20 minutes, she made a sound. Not her language. More like she was testing her throat for something. Then, she said a word in heavily accented but unmistakable English. "Safe." He glanced at her. "Yeah," he said. "You're safe." She nodded once, like she was filing that away. He dropped her at a crossroads about 40 miles north of where he'd found her. She had pointed, and he had followed the pointing, and she had indicated the intersection with a certainty that told him someone was meeting her there. He pulled over. She got out. She stood by the window and he rolled it down, not knowing why, and she looked at him with those 4 white eyes and said the English word again, differently this time, with a weight in it that he couldn't explain. "Safe." Then, she walked into the dark. He sat there for a moment. Then, he drove to Ely, delivered the metal, collected his $400, drove home, and went to sleep. He told nobody. Not his poker friends. Not his cousin in Reno. Nobody. Partly because he knew how it would sound. Mostly because it felt like something that was hers to tell, not his. He paid his electric bill. He bought groceries. He had his court date, and a payment plan got arranged, and his truck eventually decided it didn't mind cold mornings after all. Life continued in its usual low-key, undramatic fashion, except that sometimes, when he was driving Route 93 at night, he would glance at the passenger seat and think about something he couldn't name. 3 months passed. 6 months passed. He stopped thinking about it as often. But, sometimes, in that particular stillness that comes at 3 in the morning when you've been driving long enough that your brain starts doing things without you, he would hear that word in 4-eyed white-eyed silence and a voice that had been testing out human language like a hand testing the temperature of water. Safe. He didn't know what she'd come from. He didn't know who had tied her up and left her in the Nevada desert like something disposable. He didn't know her name, her world, what she'd been doing on this planet, or whether she was still alive. He knew nothing except that he had stopped, and cut the ties, and given her water, and driven north, and that she had walked into the dark. And that he had felt, in a way he could not justify and did not try to, that he had done the right thing. That was enough for him. He was not a man who expected things to get better. He was also not a man who expected the right thing to come back. He was wrong about that. 18 months after the night on Route 93, Marcus Hale pulled into his driveway at dusk, tired from a long day's work, and found something waiting for him outside his trailer door. Not a person. Not a shape in the darkness. A flat, dark object about the size of a hardback book, resting against his front step with the quiet, deliberate presence of something that had been placed, not dropped. Like a letter left by someone who knew exactly where he lived and had decided, after whatever consideration they needed to make, that he was worth finding. He stood in his driveway for a long time. The desert was orange behind him. A hawk was doing something lazy and effortless in the air above the trailer park. His truck ticked in the cooling evening air. He picked up the object. It was warm. Not from the sun, the step was in shade. Warm from itself, from whatever it was, warm the way something living is warm, and it fit in his hands like it had been made for exactly the size of his hands, and on its surface something moved, not light exactly, more like the memory of light, a slow pulse that started when his fingers closed around it. He stood there holding it. Safe. He went inside. He set the object on his kitchen table and made coffee. This was not avoidance. This was the way Marcus Hale processed things, through the routine motions of ordinary life, through the smell of grounds and the sound of water heating, because his brain worked better when his hands were doing something familiar. He had learned this about himself a long time ago, back when ordinary life had contained things worth processing, back before ordinary life had become something he simply moved through. He poured the coffee. He sat down. He looked at the object. Up close, in the yellow kitchen light, it was even stranger than it had seemed in the driveway. The surface was not metal and not quite stone, something between the two, something that had properties of both but belonged fully to neither. It was dark gray-black with a faint iridescent quality, the kind of shimmer you catch at the edge of an oil puddle, except deeper, like the color was coming from inside the material rather than off its surface. It was flat and rectangular, corners rounded, about an inch thick. The slow pulse he had felt when he first picked it up was still there, not visible, not audible, but present in the same way a running engine is present through the floor of a room even when you can't hear it. A vibration below the level of sound. He had no context for this. He had no frame of reference, no comparable experience, nothing in 38 years of fixing trucks and hauling metal and eating Tuesday poker sandwiches that gave him a vocabulary for what he was looking at. He was not a science fiction person. He didn't read much. He had seen movies with spaceships, but the spaceships in those movies had nothing to do with this quiet warm object on his kitchen table. He picked it up again. The surface changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that made him drop it or push back from the table. Subtly, the way the surface of water changes when something touches it from below. A ripple, gone before he could track it, and, then, the face of the object was different. Still dark. Still that same deep iridescent gray. But there was now a shape visible in the surface, not printed on it, not carved into it, but present in it, like something pressing through from the other side of a membrane. It was a mark. Curved lines, 3 of them, arranged in a pattern that his eye immediately wanted to call writing, even though he had no rational basis for that. It looked like writing the way music looks like emotion. There's no logical reason the connection should exist, but it does anyway. He set it down. Picked up his coffee. Drank it. Thought about the woman, the alien woman, the not human woman, sitting in his truck on Route 93 with a bottle of water and white eyes and a word she had tested in her mouth like the first step onto uncertain ground. Safe. He went to bed with the object on the nightstand. He wasn't sure why he put it there rather than back on the kitchen table. He didn't analyze it. He slept better than he had in months. In the morning she was sitting on his front step. He opened the door at 6:15 in his work clothes, coffee in hand, and she was there the same way the object had been there, quietly, precisely, with the stillness of something that has decided on its location and committed to it completely. She was wearing different clothes than before. Human clothes, close enough, though they fit her the way a language fits when you have learned it perfectly but learned it second, technically correct, slightly off in ways that were hard to name. She was still silver gray. Still taller than him. The 4 white eyes found his face immediately and held it. He stood in the doorway. She said, in English that was accented but clear, structured, like someone who had spent considerable time constructing each sentence before speaking it, "You kept it." He looked at the object in his hand, which he had apparently picked up off the nightstand without thinking. "I did." "Good." She stood.
Not standing to leave, standing the way you stand when a formal part of something is beginning. I would like to explain.
He stepped back from the door.
Coffee? A pause. Yes.
He made her coffee. She sat at his kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it for a moment with an expression he couldn't read, but that gave him the impression she was doing something deliberately human, something chosen for his comfort rather than her own. He sat across from her and waited. Her name, she told him, was not something his mouth could produce accurately.
She gave him a human approximation, Sarah.
She had been on Earth for a period his calendar would call 3 years, part of a study group, not a government-sanctioned thing, not the kind of contact humanity had been told was coming, just observers, a small team from a world that had been watching this one for a long time with the patient attention of people who understand that certain things cannot be rushed. The night he had found her, she had been intercepted. Not by the American government, not by any official body, but by a private organization that had learned of the study group's presence and wanted something from her that she was not willing to give.
She didn't elaborate on what that was. He didn't ask.
She had been held for 4 days. On the 5th night, the vehicle transporting her had developed a problem. She said this simply, without explanation, and he had the strong sense that the vehicle's problem was not coincidental, and she had been left on the roadside while her captors went to deal with it, and that was when he had come along.
"You were not afraid," she said.
"I was absolutely afraid," he said. She tilted her head.
"You acted without fear. That's different from not being afraid." She considered this. All 4 eyes steady, that ripple blink moving across them at intervals he was starting to find easier to read. "Yes," she said. "It is."
She had gone home. She said this the way someone says a word that contains more geography than it appears to, and she had reported what had happened. The study group had completed its work and most of them had left. But she had stayed.
"Why?" he said.
She wrapped her hands a little tighter around the mug.
"To understand something."
"What?" "Why you stopped."
He looked at her. "You came back to ask me why I stopped?" "I came back to understand it. I have been watching for some time. I understand the material conditions of your life. I understand that stopping was a risk with no logical benefit to you. I understand that you told no one. I understand that you asked for nothing." She paused. "I don't understand why." He thought about it. He was quiet for a while. Outside, a truck was going by on the highway, the diesel sound rising and then falling away. "She was tied up," he said finally. "That's the whole thing, really. She was tied up and I had a multi-tool." Sarah looked at him for a long time. "That is the whole thing," she said. And something shifted in her expression that he couldn't name, but that felt, somehow, like the end of a long argument she'd been having with herself. She reached across the table and touched the object with one finger. The mark on its surface shifted. The 3 curved lines rearranged, slowly, like something waking up. "This is called, in your closest equivalent word, a seed," she said. "It is not a tool. It is not a weapon. It is not information, though it contains some. It is alive, in a way your biology would not classify as alive, but which is alive nonetheless." She looked up at him. "It responds to the person who holds it. It grows based on what that person needs." "What do I need?" he said, which he meant as a genuine question. "I don't know yet," she said. "Neither does it. That's the point." He looked at the object, the seed. The pulse in it was different now, slightly faster, the vibration below the floor of sound a little more present. Like it was paying attention. "What does it do?" he asked. "Different things," she said. "For different people. I have seen one given to a man whose world was dying and it showed him how to change the atmosphere. I have seen one given to a child and it became a companion for 30 years. I have seen one that a person ignored completely and it dissolved in 18 months. What happens if I use it wrong?" "You can't," she said. "That's also the point." He picked it up. The warmth again. the mark pulsing slowly in the dark material. He turned it over in his hands. He was not a man who expected things to get better. He was a man who paid his bills when he could, drove north when that was the only direction he had, cut ties off people who needed their ties cut. "Why me?" he said. "You could go to, I don't know. A scientist. A government. Someone with resources." "I've been to those," she said quietly. "In other places. Other planets. Other first contacts." The white eyes held something he recognized now. Not quite sadness. The close cousin of sadness, the one that lives in the same house but sits in a different room. Resources are not what this is for. He sat with that. "Okay," he said. She finished her coffee. She stood. She moved toward the door with that same committed stillness, and he walked her out, and she stood in the morning desert light with the sun turning the flat scrub gold behind her, and she looked at him with 4 white eyes and said, "I'll come back." "Okay," he said again. She walked to a spot about 30 yards out from the trailer, where nothing was, and then she was not there anymore. No sound. No flash. Just the ordinary desert, and his truck in the driveway, and the seat in his hand, still warm, still pulsing, the 3 curved lines moving slowly across its surface like something thinking. He went inside. He had work to do. A water pump to replace on a neighbor's irrigation system. $40, cash. He set the seat on the kitchen windowsill where it would catch the light. He went to work. When he came home, it had grown. Not large, barely a centimeter in any direction. But the rounded corners were slightly different, and the surface had changed texture in one small area, something almost organic appearing there, a tiny ridge that hadn't been there before. He stood at the window and looked at it for a long time. He ate dinner. He watched the news. He went to bed. He did not tell anyone. But that night, for the first time in years, he dreamed not the formless gray static of an exhausted mind going through the motions of sleep, but actual dreams, vivid and strange and full of light, full of things his sleeping brain had no language for, but that left him, when he woke, with a feeling he had to search his memory to find the word for. Hope. He lay in the dark and held it carefully, the way you hold something that has been away for a long time and that you are not sure yet whether you trust. Outside, the desert was quiet. The seat on the windowsill pulsed, slow and steady, like a heartbeat learning its rhythm. The seed grew for 63 days before it did anything Marcus could put into language. In those 63 days it went from the size of a hardback book to the size of a shoebox, changing incrementally each day in ways that were easy to miss unless you had been watching closely, which he had. The texture kept evolving. The initial dark iridescent material was still there as the core, but the surface had layered over itself, developing a fine structure of interlocking shapes, not mechanical, not geometric, something between the precision of crystal and the organized complexity of a living thing, like a seed casing preparing for something that hadn't happened yet. He put it on the kitchen counter. It fit there. It seemed to prefer there, though he understood this was projection and also suspected it wasn't. The 3 curved marks were gone. They had dissolved into the surface and been replaced by something that had more of them, more complex, arranged in patterns that shifted slowly when he looked at them long enough. He had stopped trying to read them and started just watching them the way you watch water. Sarah came back twice in those 63 days. Never announced. Always morning. Always coffee, which she had developed a straightforward appreciation for that he found, without being able to fully explain why, deeply reassuring. She checked the seed each time, touched it with one finger, watched the surface for a moment, and said something in her own language, quietly, like a person checking on something they planted. On the 31st day he had asked her, "What do you think it's going to do?" She had said, "I think it's still deciding." Deciding what? What you need. I thought I didn't know that yet. You don't. It doesn't either. It learns by proximity. By time. It watches you the way I've been watching you, except it's faster at this particular kind of understanding. He had thought about that. Is that strange? Being watched? Is it strange to you? A little.
It would be strange to me also, she said, if I thought the watching was judgment.
But watching to understand is different. She looked at the seed. It's not deciding whether you are good enough. It's deciding what shape of good would help you most.
He had let that settle in his chest somewhere without naming it and gone back to his coffee. On day 63, he was replacing the brake pads on his truck in the driveway when he heard a sound from inside the trailer.
Not loud.
Like a single tone, the kind you'd get from a tuning fork, except deeper and with a quality he couldn't describe except to say it felt like something completing itself. He came inside with grease on his hands and stood in the kitchen doorway.
The seed was open. Not broken. Not cracked.
Open, the way a door is open, deliberately, with all the structure of the original object still present, the two halves of it curved back like cupped hands revealing what was inside. What was inside was a light.
Not a beam, not a glow.
A contained light, warm gold white, sitting in the hollow of the open seed the way a coal sits in a fire, present and real and generating something beyond its visible size. He crossed the kitchen slowly.
Stood over it.
The light moved slightly when he got close, orienting toward him the way a plant orients toward the sun, without drama, without fanfare, just a quiet acknowledgement of presence.
He reached out. It touched his hand before he touched it. Not physically.
There was no contact. But something moved from it to him, a transmission below the level of sensation, below even the level of thought, directly into that part of a person that processes things before words get involved. And what it gave him was not information. Not in the way he had half expected, not schematics or equations or the location of undiscovered mineral deposits or some civilization-saving technology. What it gave him was clarity. His own clarity. His own life, not as he had been living it, in the Loki, forward-moving, don't expect too much fashion he had developed as a survival strategy sometime in his late 20s, but, as it actually was, as it actually could be, laid out with the clean unsentimental honesty of something that had spent 63 days learning him and was now showing him what it had learned.
He sat down on the kitchen floor.
The things he saw, felt, understood, in those minutes with the seed's light warming his palm, were not miraculous. They were not cosmic. They were his. His neighbor Dale's irrigation system was failing in a way Dale hadn't diagnosed yet and that Marcus had the skills to fix, and there was a reasonable chance that Dale, who was getting too old to manage the property alone, would benefit enormously from a reliable person who knew how to keep aging equipment running, and Marcus could build that into something sustainable. The two young men at the gas station in Caliente who were heading nowhere because the town had nothing to offer them, he had the skills and the space to teach them mechanics, and there was a demand for mobile repair services across this entire stretch of Nevada that nobody was filling because nobody had organized it. His body was developing an inflammation in his left knee that would become a serious problem in about 4 years if he kept ignoring it. He had been ignoring it because addressing it cost money and he had been telling himself he didn't have the money, but the calculation was wrong and he had been doing it wrong out of habit.
None of this was alien technology.
None of it was a gift from the stars in the sense he might once have imagined, if he had been the kind of man who imagined things. It was his own life, seen clearly, by something that had taken the time to understand it and was now handing it back to him the way a good mechanic hands back a machine, not fixed, exactly, but diagnosed, and with a clear sense of what needed doing and what tools existed to do it. He sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. When he got up, he made 2 phone calls. One to Dale. One to the gas station manager whose name was Pete and who had been complaining about those 2 young men for months without doing anything useful about it. He didn't explain what had caused the calls.
He just made them. Sarah arrived the next morning.
She stood in the kitchen door and looked at the open seat on the counter, the light still warm in its hollow, and she was quiet for a moment with an expression he had come to recognize as the closest she got to moved. "What did it show you?" she asked. He poured her coffee. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was something she was exceptionally good at, listening with all 4 eyes and with that quality of complete attention that made you feel, while she was listening to you, that what you were saying was the most interesting thing that had been said to anyone anywhere today. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's what it decided." "That's what it decided." "You thought it would be bigger," she said.
Not a question. He considered lying. A little, he admitted. Bigger would have been easier to ignore, she said.
She sat down across from him, both hands around the mug, those white eyes steady. The large gifts always are. Something enormous and undeniable, something that removes choice from the equation. This, she looked at the seed, requires you to do something.
Which is harder? He thought about Dale's irrigation system. About Pete at the gas station. About his knee.
Yeah, he said. The people who made this believe that the most useful thing they can give a person is not capability, she said. It's the removal of the noise that was preventing them from seeing their own capability clearly.
She paused.
Your species generates extraordinary amounts of that noise.
We're working on it, he said.
Something crossed her face. Not a smile, her face did not do exactly that, but the cousin of a smile, the version of it that lives in the eyes.
I know, she said. He looked at the seed.
The light in its hollow was smaller now, quieter, the way a fire is quieter after it has finished saying what it needed to say.
What happens to it now? It becomes inert. The material persists. Some people keep them.
She turned her mug slowly in her hands.
Some give them away. He looked at her. Can it do it again? For someone else?
Once it's opened, it contains only what it found in one person.
It can't be refilled. She paused. But there are more. He sat with that. You give these out. When we find someone worth giving them to, how do you decide?
She looked at him with 4 white, steady eyes and said nothing, and he understood that the question answered itself, that the finding and the deciding were the same act, that you don't look for criteria, you look for a moment where someone acts without calculation, without benefit, without anyone watching, and the act tells you everything that criteria cannot. He had been on Route 93 with a multi-tool and a truck full of scrap metal. She had been the one tied up in the dark.
He had been the criteria. He looked down at his coffee. I've got a question, he said. I know. How many worlds? Many. And, in how many of them does it help? Does it actually often enough, she said. Not always.
The seed can only show a person their own life clearly. What they do with that clarity is still their choice.
Some people find clarity terrifying. Some people find it and do nothing with it anyway.
She met his eyes.
You won't. How do you know?
Because you stopped on Route 93, she said simply. People who stop when there's no reason to stop, when stopping costs them something, when nobody is watching, when the logical move is to keep driving, those people, when they see their lives clearly, tend to act on what they see. He was quiet for a while. Outside, a hawk was writing something thermal above the trailer park, lazy and masterful, and the morning desert was doing its particular ordinary miracle of light on flat ground and sage and the long pale road disappearing north. He had driven that road 1,000 times in the dark and thought it was empty.
Thank you, he said. She stood.
She did that formal thing again, the quality of stillness that meant something significant was beginning or ending.
Thank you, she said back, and the weight in it was different from his, larger somehow, older, like a word being said at the end of a much longer sentence than the one visible.
She moved toward the door.
Sarah, he said. She paused. Is it going to get better, he said. Earth. All of it.
Is it going to? She turned and looked at him for a long moment, and he understood she had the actual answer to this question, that she had data he would never have, that she had seen this kind of civilization at 20 different points in its development on worlds with different suns, and that she knew things he could not imagine about how stories like this one went.
She said, I don't know.
I don't think anyone does, at this stage.
A pause. But there are more seeds than there used to be. More than we gave out last time we were here. He thought about that. That's something, he said.
It's something, she agreed. She walked out into the morning, and he watched her go, and she was gone again the way she went, no drama, no spectacle, just the empty desert, and the hawk still working its lazy circles overhead, and the road going north the same as it always had.
He went inside.
He looked at the open seat on the kitchen counter, the light in it small and warm and quiet now.
He picked up his phone. Called Dale. Then, called Pete.
Then, sat down with his coffee and a notepad and started writing down the things he was going to do, not because he'd been told to, not because some cosmic force had handed him a mandate, but because he could see them clearly now, and seeing things clearly, he had learned, was the kind of thing you didn't waste. He was 38 years old. He lived in a trailer outside Caliente, Nevada. He owned one good jacket and a truck that started fine on cold mornings. He was not a complicated man. He just stopped when someone needed stopping for. It turned out that was enough. It turned out that had always been enough.